Our first panel has three extraordinary speakers, and I'm going to invite each one in turn in the order that they are listed in the program to speak, after saying literally 2 words of introduction to each one. I am not going to try and properly introduce each one because that would take most of the 90 minutes, and I apologize in advance for the truncated nature of the presentations. Or of the introductions, excuse me. Allegra McLeod is a professor of law at Georgetown University School of Law. Her current scholarship is focused upon contemporary movements for penal abolition, and I would single out her path-marking Harvard Law Review article that sets out an abolitionist agenda with respect to legal scholarship in a way that surely will be influential for generations to come. Robert Sampson is the Henry Ford II Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University and an affiliated research professor at the American Bar Foundation, as well as a founding director of the Boston Area Research Initiative. He also taught previously at the University of Chicago, and his book, Great American City, for many of us is the defining text, not just on urban sociology today, but on the city in which we live. Patrick Sharkey is a professor of sociology at Princeton University and a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University, and the former professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at New York University with an affiliation at NYU's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. His book, Uneasy Peace, is surely one of the most insightful and penetrating books that has leapt from the academy onto the public consciousness in recent years. So with, again, apologies for the brevity of those introductions, I invite Allegra to speak, and the aim is to have people speak for between 15 and 20 minutes. I'll throw in the chat a 15-minute warning, and I'm not quite sure what people do on Zoom in order to enforce a 20-minute limit, but I'll think of something.
Thank you so much, Professor Hook, to all the conference organizers, to my colleagues and co-presenters. I'm looking forward to learning from you today, and I'm grateful to be included in this discussion of the urgent problem of urban violence. I'm going to focus this morning on an abolitionist critique of violence informed by the work of contemporary social movements for abolition. Calls for abolition have animated a vital constellation of social movements in the United States and in places around the world that have worked for many decades to end the violence of imprisonment and policing, and equally important, to create more equitable, just, and peaceful forms of collective existence through mutual aid and care, violence prevention, restorative and transformative justice, and cooperative and solidaristic economic practices. Through this work, participants in these movements have offered a deep reconceptualization of the problem of violence and expansive ideas about how to address violence. The core insight of these movements is that in order to stop violence, including urban violence in Chicago and elsewhere, that's the focus of our symposium today, we must expand our conception of violence beyond individualized disorder to a broader context that includes the racialized, political, economic, and militarist roots and manifestations of violence. Entrenched racialized inequality and poverty in Chicago and in cities around the world predict premature death caused by interpersonal violence, as well as by environmental pollution and toxicity, lack of access to healthcare, to quality housing, to quality education, to food, and to other basic necessities. The most crucial factor in reducing violence is thus to eliminate entrenched racialized poverty and inequality and to dismantle the economic, political, military, surveillance, incarceration, and other systems that hold inequality in place. This print by Chicago artist and abolitionist Nicole Marroquin is styled as a protest poster and appears with a portion of the call of contemporary abolitionist movements atop a scene of Chicago police in 1972 suppressing an uprising of students at a now closed Chicago high school, the Frobel School, in a low-income community on the west side of the city. The demand to abolish is a call for an end to the management of social, political, and economic problems through militarized policing and through repressive force, but it's also, as W.E.B. Du Bois and Angela Davis have described the historical movement for the abolition of slavery and its persistent legacies, a movement for what Du Bois called a positive vision of abolition, a more just and equitable form of collective life. Here in this image, Marroquin places another contemporary abolitionist organizing demand, police-free schools, alongside an image of police restraining students at the now closed Harrison High School, also on the west side of Chicago, during a walkout to demand more Black and Latina teachers and ethnic studies courses. These images capture a political economic dynamic in Chicago of vast expenditures on policing, including of students in schools, and of repression of students amidst school closures in low-income communities. As Chicago spent hundreds of millions of dollars on militarized policing in recent decades, the former mayor, Rahm Emanuel, decided to close 50 schools in 2013 on the south and west sides of the city, a pattern that began decades earlier with the schools depicted in these prints. Mariame Kaba is an abolitionist organizer and writer and a leading abolitionist thinker who's been engaged in abolitionist organizing over several decades and who lived and worked for many years in Chicago, including on the reparations ordinance passed by the Chicago City Council in 2015 to address decades of Chicago police torture. Kaba's recent New York Times best-selling book, pictured here, We Do This Till We Free Us, published this year, has brought abolitionist ideas to a wider public. In an earlier essay in this volume, The End of Chirac, Kaba writes of violence in Chicago as follows, and this passage is excerpted on the slide here. The violence experienced by young people of color in the city is multidimensional, both interpersonal and structural. So many of the young have to swallow their rage as they're surveilled in stores and on streets, targeted by cops for endless stop and frisks, denied jobs as their schools are closed, and locked in cages by the thousands. For some, the violence and deprivation turn outward. The instrumental use of violence by some young people becomes a strategy in response to racial and economic oppression. For some of the young people I've worked with, the specter of death is a constant companion. A young man who's been behind bars for most of his formative years has told me on more than one occasion, she writes, that he was always certain his life held two viable possibilities: die in the streets or die in prison. In this passage, Kaba explains violence in Chicago is produced and exacerbated by degrading and routine police interactions with young people in resource-deprived communities, and also by a lack of access to quality remunerative employment and education, all of which breed rage and despair. As you see in these images, and as was detailed in the written introduction to the symposium that was circulated to many of us, homicides are concentrated in those parts of the city with persistent racialized poverty. The idea popular among some criminologists that additional police presence quells urban violence has taken shape with these underlying conditions of resource deprivation and entrenched racialized inequality held constant, and perhaps implicitly assuming that inequality and poverty are not subject to fundamental change. But in fact, inequality is maintained by a set of laws and policies that could be changed, and such changes would make it possible to confront at once the violence of racialized economic inequality and the violence of policing. I'll explore these core ideas through one primary illustration in my remaining time this morning, and then conclude by describing how abolitionist movements have taken up this idea in current writings, proposed legislation, and organizing. Current economic law and policy create and perpetuate entrenched racialized poverty and inequality, such that these legal frameworks ought to be understood themselves as violence. Many states have regressive tax laws under which the working poor and lower income households pay a greater portion of their income as compared to the proportion of income and assets of affluent residents subject to tax liability. Illinois, like many other jurisdictions, has a regressive flat rate income tax that disproportionately burdens the working poor and low income people and dramatically influences the racial wealth gap. Additionally, development financing schemes intended to reduce inequality have in fact deepened inequity. For example, tax increment financing, or TIF, was created in the 1970s as a somewhat obscure tax law to replace Great Society initiatives in cities with public-private partnerships. The idea was that TIF programs would enable development in so-called blighted areas. TIF funds now constitute a considerable portion of Chicago city tax revenues, yet for years, critics have argued that TIF lacks transparency and has been used to subsidize development in non-blighted areas that do not actually require public subsidies. In Chicago, more than half of the $5 billion in TIF development funds collected since 1984 have been spent in relatively affluent areas, constructing luxury residential developments, such as the one you see proposed here, entertainment and shopping venues, and rehabbing chain hotels that serve tourists and business travelers. Subsequently, those TIF districts capture property taxes that would otherwise be shared across the city, which results in losses to the overall budget for public schools. And low-income neighborhoods like Englewood on the south side, whose TIF district produced only $22 million in the 2000s, are effectively cut out from sharing the close to $2 billion in revenues generated by TIF districts in the loop. Institutionalized racial discrimination in the housing markets created redlining, contract lending, and racialized zoning that produced Chicago's racially segregated and impoverished communities. And these communities are now burdened with funding development projects from their limited property taxes while being cut out of the TIF benefits that flow to wealthier parts of the city. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot came into office promising significant change to tax increment financing, but by and large, these changes have not come to pass. It's important, too, to recognize these problems as national and international in scope, not in any way specific to Chicago. In Baltimore, which, like Chicago, is a place that suffers from high rates of entrenched racialized inequality and gun violence, development projects have invited companies to build in the city in exchange for a release from tax liability. In Baltimore, tax increment financing has supported the corporate development projects of Under Armour, for instance, the athletic gear company, beginning with a $35 million benefit in tax increment financing for an initial downtown corporate headquarters. In exchange, Under Armour offered various charitable contributions: a free water taxi system for tourists to the harbor, tactical gear, and uniforms for firefighters and police. But Under Armour was released from tax liability under the agreements. The company reported its profits in 2017 at $157 million, but did not pay any state taxes that year and received $8.3 million in state tax credits. In the last several years, Under Armour obtained substantially more TIF funding to pursue an expanded corporate headquarters, as you see here at the top of this slide, at Port Covington, and a development project for the area receiving well over $100 million. But the tremendous subsidies have yielded disappointing results and diminishing returns as the company failed to deliver on the planned luxury enclave, instead deciding in the new COVID landscape to create only 300,000 feet of new space rather than the 3.9 million square feet of mixed-use development initially promised, and retaining only 1,700 employees rather than the 10,000 jobs that had been on offer. The bizarre current project, which you see pictured on the bottom of this slide, is a single corporate headquarters building, and it's composed largely of parking lots, financed in significant part through tremendous public subsidies that offer little, if anything, in turn to those in the city most in need. Even where projects have been more successful in Baltimore at bringing valuable properties to the Baltimore Harbor Development District, the city has lost tax revenue and state funding to schools in low-income Black communities. Because of increases to property values in the city of Baltimore due to development, the state cut funding to city schools, but the city is actually starved for tax income on these luxurious properties because of deals made with the developers. For example, Harbor East Baltimore Marriott Waterfront Hotel, which is valued at $155 million, will pay just $1 a year in lieu of property taxes for 25 years. An abolitionist critique of violence reconceptualizes this political economy and the laws and policies that hold it in place as not just a factor contributing to urban violence, but as a form of violence in and of itself. This economic violence holds in place inequality and racially skewed vulnerability to premature death. Redistributing in a thoroughgoing way these resources, changing the extractive racial distribution of wealth and life chances, is a crucial component of redressing violence and would make it possible to rely on resources to prevent violence that do not threaten the violence of policing, jailing, and criminal law enforcement. In Chicago, the Grassroots Collaborative, which is a collaborative of laborers and community members in the city, has developed solidarity campaigns around principles of equity and restorative justice, including a 2020 budget proposal reflecting the needs of Chicago's working families, and which presents a critique of the city's tax policies and development projects that prioritize the wealthy and corporate elite. The budget proposal calls for reversing the decades of disinvestment from Chicago's Black and brown communities, divesting from failed policies that increase racial inequality, and raising new revenue from the wealthy and large corporations. Many of the budget proposals are a reflection of the reimagined Chicago platform reflected in this image, which was developed by the Grassroots Collaborative as an aspirational plan to transform Chicago into a city that works for everybody through targeted community investment, expansion, and protection of affordable housing, jobs programs, progressive revenue. The platform is divided into 5 parts, exhorting us to reimagine safety, community investment, healthy communities, revenue, and Chicago's economy. The platform calls for no new investment in policing whatsoever, and rather to direct that money to fund restorative justice efforts in communities and schools, calling for free universal public childcare, for an end to the practices of local polluting industries and the use of Chicago's communities of color and low-income communities as waste disposal sites. An entire section addresses the use of TIFs and recommends that all unspent tax increment finance dollars be returned to developing schools, parks, and libraries. The movement for Black Lives and their platform and vision imagine at a national scale a robust program of solidarity economy projects that could enable an alternative economic framework to regressive taxation and corporate subsidies. The movement focuses on reparations in abolitionist terms, ending resource extraction from Black communities through tax, housing, and other laws and policies, as well as robust support for access to high-quality education. The vision for an alternative economic framework emerges from solidarity economy initiatives like worker cooperatives, community land trusts, public banking, participatory budgeting, as reflected in this image by Ethan Miller of the Cooperative Alliance. These alternatives enable an economy that's more equitable and democratically controlled, shifting both resources and power. The BREATHE Act, emerging in part from the Movement for Black Lives platform, is proposed federal legislation authored by the Movement for Black Lives electoral project that likewise envisions divestment from federal and state criminal legal systems and reinvesting resources in universal childcare pilot projects, universal basic income pilot projects, Medicare expansion, and equitable public housing. The Red Deal, which is a project of the Red Nation, a grassroots indigenous liberation organization, also embraces abolition as a project of confronting at once police violence, interpersonal, private violence, economic harms, and militarism. The Red Deal envisions a divestment from military spending and occupation, and investment in dignified work to restore the planet, clean air, clean water, free universal education, healthcare, and also a broader project of decolonization, anti-capitalism, and for the return of stolen lands or land back. All of this could be enabled, the Red Deal explains, by reduced military spending. For contemporary abolitionists, to eliminate violence requires addressing its roots in these practices that produced and continue to perpetuate entrenched inequality, racialized poverty, and militarist violence. Entrenched racialized inequality originated and is maintained in the halls of power, not primarily in dispossessed neighborhoods in Chicago or Baltimore or other impoverished communities around the world, but in economic law and policy, in tax law and housing policy, and in a tradition of armed militarist violence that led to the settlement of this country through the dispossession of indigenous peoples, and that has continued ever since, from early police forces operating as slave patrols, to Klan violence and lynch mobs, to contemporary American police forces that kill approximately 1,000 civilians each year. So these are the beginnings of an abolitionist critique of violence, and I propose that these critical perspectives and strategies ought to inform fundamentally our approaches to urban violence. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Allegra. That was a terrific presentation and a terrific way to start the day. May I turn things over now to Professor Sampson?
Excellent. Great to be here, and I wish too we were together in Chicago. As was noted, I taught at the University of Chicago for 12 years. It's a great city, and I've been studying it for many years, and it's a real pleasure to be on this panel. Look forward to the discussions. So I guess I'd start out by saying that, I mean, Chicago has always been at the center of national news, it seems, in terms of violence. I mean, you can go back to the, gangster days of Al Capone, to more recent eras, the sort of height of violence in the late 20th century, captured so well by books like There Are No Children Here by Alex Kotlowitz, featured Chicago, to more recent upticks in violence, both state violence, as was just noted, for example, the shooting of Laquan McDonald. But the interesting thing is, I mean, Chicago is not at the top of the murder rates per capita or even police killings. Nonetheless, it does have a deep set of problems. And I think the city is emblematic and has a lot to teach us about violence in general. And we've seen this, lately. Last year, violence is up 50%. Last few months, we saw the shooting of Adam Toledo, a mile and a half away. 7-year-old Jaslyn Adams was sitting in her car, shot to death. What do these have in common? Well, the concentration of violence, both community violence and police killings, is entrenched. And I think of this in terms of neighborhood inequality, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. I think that spatial inequality and neighborhood inequality is really an organizing feature of city life, and particularly in Chicago. And so I'd like to go through a little bit of my research on that, but also talk about new work that perhaps will shed some new light on this. So I'm going to talk about the enduring neighborhood effect, the idea that neighborhood inequality is not just a fundamental organizing principle, but it's a deep and enduring effect on individual lives and the social organization of the larger city, and expand that to think about how everyday urban mobility factors into that. Great American City, Chicago and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect, was a work that was really focused on the idea of neighborhood effects, and the differentiation among neighborhoods in Chicago, represented by the mosaic in the picture and the cover of the book. But I think what we want to do is think beyond just the boundaries of particular neighborhoods. And oftentimes people think of neighborhood effects, or at least those studying neighborhood effects as arguing that they are internal to the neighborhood, or somehow that neighborhoods are islands unto themselves, which is just not the case. There's been a lot of work on spatial proximity, but toward the end of the book, in a section, I argued for looking at neighborhood networks in the higher order structure of the city, as I put it. And one way to think about it is to consider this graph, which is the connection among different neighborhoods in Chicago that are forged by residential mobility, that is to say, a person moving from one neighborhood to another. The circle on the left are the suburbs, and you can see kind of an outflow of the city over the period of time that I was studying Chicago. And this, in a sense, can be thought of as a network. That is to say, a residential move is establishing a tie between one neighborhood and another. I want to expand that today and propose the idea of thinking about everyday urban mobility: shopping, work, going to visit someone, friendship ties, leisure activities. This is an example of one person, just one in Boston, who I think lives down in the lower right in the Quincy area. And what this is showing over a period of months is every neighborhood that that person visited. I'll tell you how we got to that in a minute. And what you can see is a lot of different connections to neighborhoods, but many neighborhoods that are simply untouched. This person went to the sort of mid-center part of Boston, a little bit in the downtown Back Bay area, upper northeast, but really very concentrated types of flows. Let's think about someone in Manhattan. On the right-hand side, you can see another person. This time we've determined their home neighborhood in the blue square. This person visits only really lower Manhattan, a little bit into New Jersey, dislikes the Bronx, apparently, one visit over an 18-month period, a couple times in Queens, and so forth. So we can see it's very constrained patterns. But one thing we can do is to sort of step back and ask, well, what are the distances that people are traveling? How many neighborhoods are people visiting? And what are the composition of those residential neighborhoods? I'm going to argue that this tells us a lot. This is a structural way of thinking about the city that's going to go from the individual, and it's going to move up to capture both neighborhood characteristics and the larger social structure. Now, how do we get this kind of information? Well, there's a couple ways you can do it. We started out looking at geo-coded tweets. I can talk later about Twitter. I'm actually not a Twitter user. This is not necessarily representative, but it does provide a signal that we think is fairly accurate. If you look at the right graph, you can see our estimation based on over 400,000 home base users, the population of New York City. If I were to put up a census map, it would track it almost perfectly. You can see Manhattan in deep blue, the outline of the boroughs, and then as you get into the suburbs, less density of population. We retrieve their home location using methods that I'm not going to get into for big data. And what we're going to do is really look at how far people are traveling, how many neighborhoods they're going to go to, and what is the structure of that. Now I'll just give you the short story. And this may surprise you a little bit. In terms of race and class, this is true of the 50 largest cities in the United States. It's also true of Chicago. The number of neighborhoods that people visit, the median distance really does not vary that much. So Bill Wilson's idea of social isolation with respect to concentrated poverty is actually not captured or seen in these data, whether it's Chicago or other cities. So in other words, people don't live in their neighborhoods. There is movement, there is a flow throughout the entire city, and we kind of know that from our own lives. However, race trumps class and the types of destinations visited by a shocking amount. This is for Chicago. Those that live in non-poor white neighborhoods, which you can think of as, people often refer to this as sort of the mainstream, quote unquote. I'm not saying that in a normative sense, just in the sense of average number of neighborhoods, or in the language that Wilson used, almost 90%, 85% of residents from those types of neighborhoods are visiting other non-poor white neighborhoods. And even those from poor white neighborhoods, 80% are to non-poor whites. What happens when we look at those that live in non-poor black or black Hispanic neighborhoods? It's a world of difference. And in fact, if you look at just black neighborhoods, the surprising thing here is that there's really no class difference. That is to say, residents of poor black neighborhoods and non-poor black neighborhoods visit non-poor white neighborhoods about 25% of the visits compared to over 80. So this is a deep underlying structural difference. Bear in mind, again, there's not really any difference in the extent of travel. It's the types. So this motivates a new class of questions, I argue, and my colleagues. And this presentation with Brian Livy is going to probe that a little bit more. We published an article in Sociological Methods and Research that basically looks at the larger structure of the city, taking a network approach. Again, arguing that everyday movement provides a new angle, broader experiences to look at social segregation beyond the residential setting. So think of neighborhoods as a node, and then think of the edges or the ties among neighborhoods connected through moves. And we can look at the extent to which ties in a city are concentrated. Eli Anderson, for example, argues about this idea of cosmopolitan canopy, where people come together, a hub or public commons. You might think of Millennium Park in Chicago or other places. Are there places like that in a city? And then the equitable mobility in a city. And that is essentially the extent to which the mobility networks are even. Technically, for the network aficionados among you, this is just quantifying essentially how much the network would have to change to make it evenly distributed. And basically, and this is published, and I'm now putting the homicide rates here in a quadrant. And the equitable mobility and concentration of visits are actually not that related. You can see the scatter plot, but what you can see and what we found is that the highest homicide rate cities, those in red, tend to be shifted toward the bottom left quadrant, which are cities that have a low structure of equitable neighborhood mobility and low, let's call it a sort of a public commons. Detroit, the highest rate, has very low rates of equitable mobility, the lowest rate of shared visitation areas, actually. But Chicago, as you can see in the left, has one of the highest rates of inequitable mobility, if you put it that way. That is to say, people are not sharing evenly their visits. And you kind of got an intuition of that from the earlier graph. And it's about on the mean of the sort of public commons. In a further paper in Urban Studies that just came out, we did this for racial segregation. Turns out Chicago is one of the highest segregated cities by race, that is racially segregated in terms of this kind of everyday mobility. So that's sort of a city level view. But now I want to kind of drill down and focus a little bit more on this idea of neighborhood and introduce the concept of triple disadvantage. So imagine now sort of a stylistic portrayal of 6 types of neighborhoods. We can think of disadvantaged neighborhoods, middle-class neighborhoods, and advantaged neighborhoods. But then we can also think about how they're connected to other neighborhoods. And this is a scale that takes into account both dimensions of advantage, disadvantage, from managerial professionals, education, to the concentration of poverty. So disadvantage at the high end, advantage at, if you think about concentrated affluence, for example, that would be the white areas. Triple disadvantage in the upper left corner, A. This neighborhood is triple disadvantaged. Why? It is poor, it is residentially disadvantaged, but the flows of residents are disproportionately to other neighborhoods of disadvantage. And furthermore, it's kind of a double disadvantage. The rates of flow into that neighborhood are also only from other disadvantaged neighborhoods. So you can think of this as kind of, adding on to the disadvantage of neighborhoods in a very unique way that gets beyond what other research has looked at. you can switch it and look at the upper end. This is not a focus just on the poor. Triple advantage, in a way, is kind of a form of opportunity hoarding, I suppose. You could think of certain neighborhoods in Chicago, not just that they are advantaged, but their residents are connected only to other disadvantaged neighborhoods. And moreover, the people visiting those neighborhoods are from other advantaged neighborhoods. Now, this is a stylistic example, but I think it portrays the concepts. And I want to argue, and we show, I believe, and this is just published in the American Sociological Review, that this has import for violence, and I believe other factors, including collective capacity and forms of social organization. So here we go. This is actually new data because we looked at the 50 largest cities. We could get homicide incidents that were geocoded down to the block group in 37 of the largest cities. So we looked at actually over 32,000 homicides. And this pattern is consistent in all the cities. I'm going to show you Chicago because that's what we're talking about. This is a period that I'm going to portray here of considerable change. I mean, 2014 was the Juan McDonald shooting. The homicide rate went up. What you can see is a deep concentration of homicides proportional to the number in the neighborhood, concentrated on the west and south sides, but very carefully calibrated almost to triple disadvantage. And that's scaled by standard deviation units. If we then move to when we just got these data in 2019 to 2020, which, as those of you in Chicago know, I mean, last year the homicide rate was up, I think, 40 to 50%. So a tremendous increase. And what you see is a very parallel pattern, hence the idea of the enduring neighborhood effect. Now, if I were to plot police killings on here, we would see a concentration. I haven't done it yet, but I believe that it's fairly similar. For example, shootings recently, but also in past years in neighborhoods like Englewood, far west side. So this double burden, in a way, of violence is, as the previous presentation noted, very uneven. But what I want to argue here, at least with respect to lethal violence in the community, is deeply concentrated, not just by concentrated poverty. And what I'm not showing you here in all the gory details is that this really is an added value. And I can show you a bit with this graph. And this is consistent across the United States and all city. The mobility-based disadvantage independently predicts violence above concentration of poverty. So the circle line, a solid line, if you will, is the relationship between concentration of poverty, traditionally defined in violence, and the dashed line is triple disadvantage. And as you can see, it's a sharper slope. It's about a 35% higher rate at the sort of at the ends of the distribution. The confidence intervals clearly show differences. So it's not just that it's related. In fact, we know that if you are, if you have a high concentrated disadvantage neighborhood, it's not surprising in a way, given inequality, that the in degree in network terms, or the flows in, are disproportionately poor. That in itself, right, is a form of a neighborhood effect. But when you add this all together, it's really what I think of as sort of a compounded disadvantage that's taking into account the entire structure of the city. And by the way, in the initial proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences panel, we also looked at ties to the entire metropolitan area. So it's not just within city, it also is for the entire area. So the argument is that this is a construct that both empirically and theoretically has added value, and I think provides a way to think about inequality. And furthermore, it's racially divided, much more so than poverty. So let me give you two statistics on that. If you just look at something like the proportion of people in poverty at the neighborhood level, the ratio for those living in predominantly Black neighborhoods versus predominantly white neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods about 10 to 1 higher rate. We know that. If you look at the concentration of triple disadvantage, and this was done in a paper in Urban Studies looking at all cities, it's about 33 to 1. In other words, it's a huge difference, but it's much more so than just regular poverty. Here's triple disadvantage in Chicago, 1 full standard deviation below the mean for predominantly white neighborhoods. And then you can see this sort of hierarchy where predominantly Black neighborhoods are much, much higher, 1 full standard deviation above, few outliers at the bottom. The distributions are almost totally non-overlapping for all intents and purposes, really not. Predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods, as defined by the census, are also highly disadvantaged relative to white neighborhoods, a little bit less so than Black neighborhoods. In mixed neighborhoods, or as you get into more integrated neighborhoods, with respect to triple disadvantage, you get into a somewhat more parity with the predominantly white neighborhoods. Okay, you might think this is just a Twitter story. It's not. So very quickly, other ways to get at this include cell phone data, cell phone tracking. We all have cell phones that are tracking us. A lot of times we don't know it. We don't necessarily know the apps that are being used to track, but nonetheless, using recent data, 2 kinds of data we used. This is from SafeGraph, a company collects cell phone apps. We just ran this. The correlation at the national level is 0.86 between our measure of triple disadvantage in 2015 and SafeGraph in 2019. That's pretty strong. In Chicago, it's 0.91, rounded up. So what I can say is that while we haven't done the full analysis replicating it in the multivariate sense, the patterns are very close. And we have done it in Houston with a different technology company. But I just show you this to say that it doesn't necessarily have to be any one source of data. It's really the theoretical idea of taking population flows into account. Okay, so let me conclude. I think mobility-based connections provide a new perspective, I think, in 2 ways, at least. One is citywide patterns. I mentioned that Chicago is exceedingly high on socially and racially segregated patterns in terms of everyday mobility. And then again, this goes beyond just what you can see from a dissimilarity index from the census. Then at the neighborhood level, it also provides a new way, I think, of really conceptualizing how inequality works, and particularly its spatial and social network properties and how those are related to racial inequality at the larger structural level. And I think in future research, we are, but I think other people are also looking at things like other sources of mobility, like why is it that we see these patterns, right? I think violence is a factor. I think racial discrimination and reports of people, if one feels one is going to be harassed in a neighborhood where one is a racial outsider, that's a mechanism that could produce these patterns. Institutional and organizational density, we're linking measures of that into the data. We have done some of that. I don't think in terms of the patterns I showed you, it would explain it fully, but we are looking at that. I think that we're also looking at what are the mechanisms that produce this in terms of the kinds of encounters that occur in neighborhoods that are triply disadvantaged in terms of drug markets, interpersonal friction. But then again, you can also flip it and think, well, what are the mechanisms that protect, if you will, concentrated affluent neighborhoods? We're also working on that. And then finally, I think that triple disadvantage, but more broadly, neighborhood networks are related to collective efficacy, the extent to which cohesion is built in neighborhoods and informal social control, and even reform, whether it comes to governance implications. So one of the things I think that is going on here is that it's much more difficult to maintain a kind of collective approach when you have this added burden of triple disadvantage in neighborhoods. And so coalition building, I think, is something that should be factored in here, and how community-based organizations are set up to confront the problem. And finally, I think, as I started with, we really need to think about the dual burden. And this is, again, consistent with the previous presentation of community violence and police violence or state violence. These are often separated in conversations. I think scientifically, that's not the way that we should think about it. It's not that the causes are necessarily the same, but the burdens and the manifestations in space and time often are, and in Chicago and other cities certainly are, with respect to the African American population in particular, and segregated minority neighborhoods that are overlaid with a deep structure, as I've shown, of inequality when it comes to the material and social aspects of life. So I think when we are talking about reform, we really need to take these kinds of structural considerations into account. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob, for that deeply illuminating presentation. Really appreciate it. Can I turn things over to Pat Sharkey?
Thanks, Aziz. It's great to be with all of you today. So it's funny to follow Rob Sampson. Rob was my advisor in grad school, and I started working on violence because I began working on a project where he kind of let me in as an RA. So everything that I have learned about Chicago came from working with Rob. And so as a consequence of that, a lot of the themes that I'll talk about are very similar because everything I've learned from Rob and how he's done his research over time. But the focus, I thought what might be useful here is to kind of give the lay of the land, give the scope of the challenge that we're all talking about in spatial terms and in historical terms. And someone just, if this is not advancing as it should, just let me know. So I wanted to look at violence in Chicago over a very long time frame and went back all the way to 1965 through 2020 in an analysis with Elizabeth Marsteller, who's a co-author on this analysis in this paper. And I wanted to start with my book, which came out a couple of years ago, where I focused on the decline of violence that occurred in cities all over the country, including Chicago, from the early 1990s to the low point in 2014, or at least the low point in terms of the national level of violence in modern America, when the murder rate went down to 4.4 murders for every 100,000 people. And I was looking back over the book, thinking about what has happened in the past year and the sharp rise in violence that happened in 2020, but really that has been gradually occurring since 2014, since that low point. And went back to a passage in the book, and I apologize for the length of this. I won't read the whole thing, but this is the conclusion of the preface to the book. And in the book, I make the empirical case that the decline of violence had its greatest impact on the most disadvantaged segments of the population and the most disadvantaged communities in the US. So the decline of violence reduced urban inequality. And the benefits are very tangible. Benefits in terms of life expectancy, academic achievement, economic mobility. But then I concluded that discussion with a caveat that the decline in violence that changed urban America is fragile, and it's threatened by all of the things that we've seen play out over the last several years in terms of brutal police violence, in terms of the rhetoric from the president, but also, from the Attorney General under President Trump, language that is filtered out through state legislatures and mayors. And then the last thing that I note here is that it is threatened by a broader, more troubling trend that has been developing for the past 40 years, the rise of urban inequality. And I go forward to talk about concentrated poverty and conclude that the new American city is historically safe, but shockingly unequal. So with that as a starting point, I thought it was a good moment to revisit what has happened in the years since I wrote that book, in the years since I was studying the decline of violence, and to kind of place that decline within both the historical context, but also a spatial context. What have these changes, what have these trends actually looked like in different communities of Chicago? And Elizabeth and I are doing similar analysis in across the major cities of the U.S., but there aren't many places where you can go all the way back to 1965, and we can do this using the homicides in Chicago data set that Richard and Carolyn Block put together, which tracks homicides in Chicago at the census tract level, went all the way from 65 to 95, and then from there we can use public data sources to look at murders in particular in Chicago neighborhoods over time. So what you see as a starting point is, in the middle of this graph from the 90s when violence reached its peak in Chicago, through the early part of the 2000s and all the way to 2014, there was a major decline in violence, a very real decline in violence that had very tangible benefits for the residents of Chicago. That has been erased entirely, almost entirely in the years since. So in the last few years, the murder rate in Chicago has risen back up almost to its peak over the past 55 years. So this is the starting point. When you look at the murder rate for a city, you're obscuring how this is actually distributed across the communities of a city. So as a starting point, what Elizabeth and I wanted to look at was, what is the spatial distribution of violence in Chicago, and how has this changed over time? So you're looking at maps of the distribution of murder in Chicago, beginning all the way back in 5-year increments in the 1960s and 1970s. And then, so this is a pattern that is now very familiar in the communities that have been the objects of disinvestment, the objects of punishment, the objects of abandonment for the past 60 years. These are the conditions that make a community vulnerable to violence. And you see that in the early period, and then moving forward from this, these are the same maps. And I'm sorry, it's a little bit difficult to see the contrast, but here we are from the 60s through the 80s, and then from 2000 all the way to 2022, you have the same, violence has spread out to a larger segment of the South Side and the West Side, but you have the same spatial distribution of violence. And this becomes very clear when you look at, so what we did here is we grouped neighborhoods, which are in the form of census tracts, by the homicide rate from 65 to 70. Okay, so these are quintiles of neighborhoods based on the murder rate in the late 1960s, when violence first rose to extreme levels in Chicago, or at least I shouldn't say first rose, but since 1950 onward, this is the period when violence reached extreme levels. And this group that had the highest levels of violence in this group of neighborhoods that had the highest levels of violence in the late 1960s has remained the most violent communities within the city over the past 5 decades and longer. So there's a stability, there's fluctuation in the middle. Communities have moved around and changed quite a bit over this period from 1965 to the present. But you see at the top and the bottom, there's a stability of exposure to violence. Now, what does this look like in terms of the average experience for different segments of the population? To create these graphs, this is an exposure index for anyone who's familiar with the segregation literature, and it tells you the rate, the murder rate in the neighborhoods of the average poor resident of Chicago and the average non-poor resident of Chicago. Okay, and what this graph shows is fluctuation. So you see the trends in violence play out in terms of the average, the level of violence in the average poor and non-poor resident community, and yet a stability in terms of the relationship between poverty and exposure to community violence, a ratio that hasn't changed much. So if you follow this dotted line here, it shows this just the ratio of the murder rate in the average poor versus non-poor resident of Chicago's neighborhood, and it's basically been 2 to 1 over the full period from 1965 to 2020. Poor residents of Chicago live in neighborhoods that have twice the level of violence as non-poor residents of Chicago. Okay, this has been extremely stable. When we look at race, the story gets much more disturbing, much more troubling. So these graphs show the murder rate in the neighborhoods of the average Black resident of Chicago and the average white resident, and then the average in the neighborhoods of the average residents from all other ethnic groups. And we had to use that classification because we're going all the way back to 1965, okay? So it wasn't possible to look at Latinos in particular, to look at other groups in particular, because the data just weren't available back in 1970, 1980. So that's a constraint here. This is not non-Hispanic Blacks. This is all Black Chicago residents, including Hispanic or Latino residents who classify as Black. Okay, and so what this is showing is that first, in the middle of this graph, the crime decline had an enormous impact on the experiences of Black Chicago residents. So it did not eliminate racial gaps in the experience of exposure to community violence by any degree. And yet, the change that took place over that period represented a substantial change in the everyday experience of Black Chicago residents. That has not only been erased, but we're now at a point where the murder rate in the neighborhoods of the average Black resident of Chicago are higher than they have ever been over these past 55 years. That's the scale of the challenge that we're dealing with right now. If you look at the ratio of the murder rate in the neighborhood of the average Black versus white resident, it has always been extremely high over this period. But it is now higher than it has ever been over the past 55 years. So you have a racially stratified increase in violence that's taken place since 2000, really, but that has really intensified in the last several years. And then part of understanding this trend is looking specifically at what has happened in segregated neighborhoods. Okay, so this is a story about disinvestment. This is a story about the persistence of segregation in Chicago, the persistent disinvestment in Black neighborhoods in Chicago, the abandonment of Black neighborhoods, and the response to inequality through punishment that has taken place on a consistent basis, but that has really ramped up over time in the past 20 years. So if you look at just majority Black neighborhoods and majority white neighborhoods, you see starkly different trends in violence by community. Okay, so this is, again, just looking at Black neighborhoods that have at least 50% Black residents and neighborhoods that have at least 50% white residents. The number of these neighborhoods has changed over time as the city has become more diverse. So you have to keep that in mind. At the same time, this tells us that majority Black neighborhoods have become the locations where this surge in violence has been concentrated. I'm going to skip that and make one more point, that this is not just about race. This is about the interaction of race and segregation and concentrated poverty in Chicago, okay? And the way to make that point is this. So this line on the bottom here, this dotted line on the bottom, shows the murder rate in the neighborhoods of the average Black resident of Chicago who does not live in a majority Black neighborhood, okay? So this is Black residents who live in a neighborhood that has lower levels of segregation. The dashed line at the top shows the murder rate in neighborhoods of the average Black resident who lives in a majority Black neighborhood. Okay, so what this is telling us is that most of the story about racial gaps in exposure to community violence is driven by what has happened in majority Black neighborhoods. Again, the locations of long-term disinvestment, abandonment, and punishment. And then, you know, as Rob said, these same neighborhoods are the communities that have not only been the objects of, have not been only been exposed to high levels of violence, they have been the communities that have been targeted by this policy regime of aggressive and violent policing and mass incarceration. And so these data show that the same communities, the same areas of the city have been hit by all three dimensions of disadvantage: high violence, high police violence, and high incarceration. Okay, so a few basic conclusions. And again, this is I know it's difficult for an outsider. I don't live in the city, and sometimes it's difficult for an outsider to tell you how things are working in the city. So I'm trying to just lay out the scale of the problem in the hopes that this will generate more information that will inform the later panels as well as this one. Then the decline of violence has been completely erased in Chicago. Poor residents of Chicago live in neighborhoods with twice as much violence as non-poor residents, and this ratio hasn't changed. Black residents of Chicago live in more violent neighborhoods than at any point since 1965. The gap between Black and white residents' neighborhoods is larger than it has been at any previous point over the past 55 years. Racial gaps in exposure to community violence are driven entirely by segregation, and the same communities hit hardest by violence have also been the targets of violent policing and mass incarceration. So returning to my book, when I wrote this book on the decline of violence, I made 5 points. Violence is a fundamental challenge of urban America. Nothing else about cities works if cities have high levels of violence. Violence plummeted after the 1990s. The fall of violence had its greatest impact on the most disadvantaged, but the dominant approaches to confronting violence came with staggering costs. Those costs came in the form of police violence, came in the form of intensive surveillance, came in the form of mass incarceration. The last conclusion is that there is sufficient evidence to call for a new model to confront urban violence, one driven by investment rather than punishment. The 2 questions that I'll leave you with. In cities where the progress of the crime drop has been lost, what comes next? What does the next model look like? How difficult is it to imagine a new model at a time of extreme violence? Secondly, and this is the challenge that I've really been dealing with in thinking about policy responses, is it possible to make durable progress on the problem of violence without confronting the larger challenge of extreme segregation, disinvestment, and inequality across the communities of the Chicago metro? And I'm not going to answer that question, but folks in Chicago and panelists and speakers later today, I think this is a central challenge that we all have to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat, and thank you again, Rob and Allegra, for the terrific presentations. Let me suggest the following with respect to the roughly 25 minutes we have for discussion. I have 3 questions for one for each of the panelists, but I would propose to not ask them immediately, but rather allow members of the audience, and I would particularly encourage the student members of the Law Review to participate at this stage, to ask questions first, and then I'm happy to step in if there are gaps or time remaining, rather than trying to dominate. Let me start out by trying to put on the table 3 questions, one for each of the panelists, and I'll try and do so in a way that is try and make the questions brief rather than extensive. So for Allegra, the diagnosis that you gave of the structural causes of violence pushes toward an analysis that is either national or global in scope, rather than local in scope. The proposals that you ended with were largely, but not exclusively, local. The question is what role local policy change has in relation to what might be characterized as a larger. I think that you would not object to the word neoliberal economic arrangement that is now familiarly described in usually in international rather than even national terms. Right? So what kind of progress can be made with respect to that level of system with respect through the use of local interventions? For Rob, my question is about his EMI variable. I think I was surprised by how much variance there was in levels of EMI between the different cities that you showed, and I wonder whether you could say something about why EMI, as you define it, varies across cities. One thought is the nature or the structure of the local labor market, and the extent to which there's downtowns that are dependent upon labor that is supplied by minority neighborhoods. But that maybe there are other explanations for variances or other patterns or causes of variance in EMI. For Pat, the question is whether the remedies or the recommendations that his earlier work identifies as being cost-effective tools in promoting the earlier crime decline that started in the 1990s either do or do not carry forward, or either are likely or are not likely to carry forward to the current context, right? So are there differences or parallels between the period of 30 years ago and the present day that might suggest either causes for optimism or causes for pessimism with respect to the fungibility of policy interventions of the kind that particularly Uneasy Peace describes? So I hope there's open up lines of inquiry.
Yeah, it's a great question, Aziz, and in terms of what happened in the 1990s, I think there are a set of changes that took place all at the same time, and some of them are well known. So there was a heavy investment in law enforcement, and also just a change in tactics, a much more aggressive, much more violent, much more brutal style of policing, where police were really asked to dominate public spaces, to go after gang activity aggressively, to shut down open-air drug markets. Prosecutors became more aggressive. This is the era of the harshest sentencing laws. and in addition, a whole bunch of private forces, private efforts were made to carry out intensive surveillance with camera systems, private security guards, additional technology. There was another thing that happened in the 1990s, which was there was a large-scale mobilization that took place in the communities hit hardest by violence, where residents and local organizations formed and came together to retake parks and playgrounds and city streets, to march against violence, to generate services for addiction, for mental illness, for after-school programs. So that part of the story is always left out of discussions about the crime drop, but it was very real, and it took place on a national level. And I know about this because we looked at national data on the nonprofit sector and saw this explosion of nonprofits designed specifically to build stronger neighborhoods and to confront violence. And then we developed methods to identify the causal effect that they had. And the conclusions were that those changes should stand alongside those other changes that we know about and we've heard so much about as explanations for why violence fell. So when we think about how to move forward, the question is, how do we reduce violence, and how do we do it without the staggering costs that have come through police brutality, police violence, mass incarceration? And I do think we have a model, investment in community organizations and residents. There is a model that is not just based on how I think the world should work. It's based on a large body of evidence that says that residents and community organizations actually have the greatest capacity to control violence. They've just never been given the commitment and the resources to do so in a sustainable way.
I can answer the question Aziz posed that I think is a really important and deep one. And I have several thoughts in response to it. I think some of the material that I ended with, trying to direct attention to the various writings and other platforms that are trying to envision in a capacious way a path forward, are directed at the national scale and even the global scale. So the platform of the Movement for Black Lives, for example, the BREATHE Act is proposed federal legislation. The Red Deal is trying to think about these concerns in a larger spatial perspective. And before the pandemic especially, there were various kind of convenings and organizing campaigns among abolitionists that were pressing in that direction. I'm thinking in the Chicago context of BYP 100 and other Black youth who were pressing for changes in part by petitioning the United Nations, calling attention to police violence in the city and using that as leverage to bring about a changed national perspective on the problem of police violence, but also local change, and also solidarity and kind of joint political education that brought people together in cities around the United States with organizers in Brazil and in other parts of the world. Another way that I think it's worth thinking about this problem is in terms of what Harsha Walia describes as prefiguration, something that I think about some in the piece in the Harvard Law Review that Aziz mentioned. A number of the solidarity economy projects that are the focus of Grassroots Collaborative, but also some of the other organizations I mentioned, are trying to instantiate at the local level a set of democratic projects that are scalable. For example, participatory budgeting has started to reshape the landscape of local spending on militarized policing versus other kinds of programs, not just in US cities, but in places around the world. I also think about some of the cooperatives organizing as having this potential as well. So for example, one way to think about a cooperative is a kind of small worker-owned program. But the Evergreens cooperatives, which are based in Cleveland, offer a model that I think has a kind of tremendous scalable potential. So the idea there was that a set of predominantly minority-owned local cooperatives grew to such a point that they were able to negotiate with major um, uh, anchor institutions, as they refer to them, in Cleveland. So, like Cleveland hospitals, local universities, and to organize to create a situation where all of the purchasing, or a considerable amount of the purchasing of that anchor institution, um, had to come from these networked cooperatives. And what that does is it provides us a substantial resource base for this solidarity economy project to reshape the local political economy. And that's something that has been successful in that context and taken up enthusiastically in these solidarity economy movements in various parts of the United States, but again, not just at a national scale, as a way of thinking about confronting neoliberalism in a broader context. So those are big challenges, and they're this is not obviously an adequate or thorough response to those concerns, but those are two ways that I think it's important to recognize these movements as grappling with that challenge.
Aziz, I'll answer your question. It was a good one. You asked about EMI, which is the Equitable Mobility Index. Think of that, for those that may have joined late, as the extent to which travels across a metropolis are evenly, more or less evenly spread. And I think it's a pretty fundamental dimension of social life, because for decades we have measured and thought about segregation with the residential dissimilarity index. I mean, there's the exposure index, there's 4 or 5 different indices, but they're all based on census data on where people live. Of course, that's important. But again, this is getting at the extent to which people are in contact with other neighborhoods, right? So it's a very tangible measure. Now, we don't know what's actually happening in those neighborhoods when you're with, let's say, another person. Are you talking to them? We don't know, but it's the potential in any event for interaction. So at the city level, we looked at things like transportation, land use, population size, income inequality, racial segregation, and maybe you won't be surprised, but this is what ties it all together. One of the key predictors of equitable mobility is segregation, racial segregation overall. So that is to say, when you do have more residential segregation, you also have more segregation of everyday life. But we went further in a recent paper to calculate the racially segregated mobility, what we call the SMI, the Segregated Mobility Index. Sorry to throw acronyms out at you, but we thought it was important to capture precisely not just overall flows, because as we've seen, everything unfortunately seems to be so divided by race that we wanted to precisely capture segregated mobility index. And this, in a way, I think links nicely to Pat's work. We showed that that long history is that cities that have high segregated mobility, racially segregated mobility, are cities that have are not just segregated, but have a large proportion Black population and a history of racial conflict in the past. So there's this enduring legacy, I believe, of city racial inequality that leads to a kind of this imprint that seems to have this residue that carries over, so that you see it captured. And I want to say one other thing. This is speculation, but I think we're charged with being a little bold here. One of the things I think is important about conceptualizing the city this way in our measure is, what is it actually capturing, and how might it affect our current moment? And I think it has to do with polarization, because we hear a lot about political polarization, but this is actually getting at physical separation. So if people are living in affluent neighborhoods, for example, and aren't exposed to neighborhoods of let's say, poverty, to me, that raises serious questions about things like empathy and the ability to actually conceptualize what it's like, even if it's exposure, even if you're not living there. It's really important with respect to the fundamental principles of social organization and what we know about racial attitudes, and so I'm tying it now again in a speculative manner to what Allegra was talking about. Also, Pat, in the sense of if you are going to have policies that are broader in scope and that are integrative in nature, that has to have at some fundamental level of support. And I see this increasing polarization and the extent that people are separated. I mean, if you are sort of in a cocoon of a concentrated affluent neighborhood, in a sense, that's easier for people to not see. It literally is out of sight, out of mind. Not just neighborhoods. People are traveling about, but the social distance is very deep. And to me, that's one of the reasons we see so much conflict over policies. We have this segregated everyday life. So I think there are implications here that are fairly deep, to go well beyond violence, and I would just invite us to think about how these larger social policies and investments are related.
If I can draw out a general point that I think is particularly salient for the legal scholarship is often focused upon prescription and policy, but is relatively inattentive to a point that I think all three of you have identified, and that is, I think, being surfaced really well by your papers, and the discussion right now, which is in the social sciences, there's an understanding of the importance of distinguishing and understanding the connections between formal governance structures, informal social structures, and economic structures, and thinking about the causal links between them and the priority of one or the other in different situations. All three of you have talked, I think, about the problem of distinguishing between those layers and thinking about what causes what. This is something that I think legal scholars generally fail to pay attention to. And one of the benefits of having an interdisciplinary dialogue of this kind is that you're, I think, even in this conversation, successfully and importantly drawing attention to dynamics that are neglected by legal scholars who are influential with respect to policy choices. Let me take the moderator's prerogative of calling on the people who have their hands up a little bit out of order. I'm going to derogate my colleague, John Rappaport, to the bottom of the queue because he's going to get to talk later. And I'm going to put to the top of the queue the student who has their hand up, and then call on Adam Davidson and LaToya Baldwin-Clark in the order that they put their hands up. But Emily Vernon, please. I'd love to hear a question.
Hi, I apologize. I can't turn my webcam on at the moment. But thanks so much for your presentations. Professor Sharkey, I was wondering, one of the slides you had up earlier showed kind of this reversal in the downward trend of violence. And I was wondering, because that's been such a recent reversal, what you think some of the factors driving that might be, and two possible explanations came to mind. One is, I guess this was mentioned earlier during the panels, but Mayor Emanuel's closing of a lot of schools in the South and West sides, and if that might have some sort of destabilizing effect in those communities. And also, I wonder, just given how disruptive COVID has been on schooling everywhere, but particularly in communities that don't have reliable access to internet, for example, if there's any evidence suggesting that just the important anchoring function that schools have in their communities might contribute to a resurgence in violence.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so I'll focus just on last year because the rise in violence last year was not unique to Chicago, but was experienced in actually the vast majority of U.S. cities. And I will be speculating here. So we're doing lots of work with Elizabeth and with other collaborators to try to understand what happened last year. But we really need ethnographic work to make sense of what was happening on the ground. What I will say is, in a general way, last year was a year of destabilization on multiple fronts. And so part of that was a disconnection that happened during the pandemic where everyday life was disrupted, and that then translates into following along your example, Emily, kids not interacting with the institutions that structure their daily lives, not just school, but also after school programs shut down, libraries shut down in the summer, lots of summer jobs programs shut down, public parks may not have been open, so that disrupts the patterns of everyday life that structure life through the coordination of institutions, families, and young people. That certainly played a role. And then the second part is that when you rely on a local social order where police are asked to dominate public spaces in the effort to reduce violence, and I think that is what the U.S. has done on a large scale. We have asked the police to dominate public space in order to keep violence low. When you rely on that model, and then that model is disrupted, and it was disrupted after the protests around George Floyd, then you create the conditions for a destabilized social structure, which means police may change their activity. Residents also step back and are not willing to go along with the way things have been going for a long time. And that means residents aren't talking with police officers, aren't providing information, may check out altogether. So these processes disrupt a local social order, which can create the conditions for violence to rise. That's a general pattern, not specific to Chicago, but I do think that those patterns, when you're dependent on the police to dominate public space, and then they step back, it doesn't mean protests cause violence. It means that destabilized social order creates the conditions where violence can emerge. And I think that's part of what happened last year, which was a violent year right from the start all the way through the end. So it certainly wasn't just about the period after late May, when the protests happened.
We're at 10:45, and I want to be respectful both of the presenters' time and of everyone's need to be away from a screen for some period of time during the day. So I'm going to ask Latoya and Adam if they have questions for the panelists to shoot them emails or otherwise get to them. And then ask everyone to join me in thanking Allegra McLeod, Rob Sampson, and Pat Sharkey for phenomenal presentations that really set the stage for both the dialogue that will continue today and for what I am certain will be a really important contribution to the legal scholarship. So thank you so much.